It was a quiet afternoon at the Sussex estate, the kind of stillness that feels almost staged, as if the air itself is holding its breath. Harry had been moving through the house with no particular agenda, enjoying the rare moment of peace. Meghan was away for the day, attending what she described as a private meeting with a potential charity partner. The dogs were asleep, the phones were silent, and for the first time in weeks, there was no urgent royal or business matter demanding his attention. He found himself drifting into their shared bedroom, glancing at familiar things, framed photographs from public events, the neatly folded blankets at the foot of the bed, Meghan's perfume bottles lined up in a perfect row on the dresser. Everything seemed exactly as it should be, until his eyes fell on something tucked away in the corner of the dressing table, Meghan's ornate jewelry box. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Harry had seen it before, of course, but it was usually closed and locked. Today, however, the latch was undone, as though someone had recently been inside. He didn't approach it with suspicion at first. In his mind, this was simply part of her personal space, a collection of the fine, delicate things she'd accumulated over years of travel and work. But something about the way it sat open, almost inviting inspection, drew him closer. The box itself was an object of fascination. Carved from deep walnut wood, polished to a soft sheen, and lined with plush velvet, it was the kind of heirloom that seemed to hold stories in its grain. A small brass plate on the lid bore her initials. The craftsmanship was so meticulous that it seemed more like a work of art than a container. As he lifted the lid, the faint scent of her perfume mixed with the earthy smell of aged wood. Inside, he found the expected at first: sparkling earrings, delicate bracelets, a few rings he recognized from their public appearances together. These were pieces he'd seen her wear to dinners, premieres, or royal functions. He smiled briefly, recalling moments tied to each accessory. But as he began to gently sift through the compartments, he noticed a thin layer of dust in one corner, a space clearly not touched for a long time. Something about that tiny detail made him pause. Tucked beneath a folded silk handkerchief was a small, velvet pouch. Its deep burgundy color had faded slightly with age, and the drawstring was frayed. It wasn't the sort of pouch jewelers use for newly purchased items. This had history. Harry loosened the string and tipped the contents into his hand. That's when he felt the weight, heavier than a simple fashion ring. 2 gold bands rolled into his palm, each distinct in style, but both unmistakably wedding rings. For a moment, his mind refused to process what his eyes were telling him. He turned them over slowly, the way someone examines an artifact, searching for clues. The first band was simple yet elegant, its surface slightly worn as though it had been worn daily for years. Inside, engraved in small, neat script, was a man's name he had never heard before, along with a date from more than a decade ago. A wave of confusion washed over him. There had to be an explanation, some harmless reason for this. Maybe it was a gift from a relative, or a prop from a role Meghan had once played. But then he looked at the second ring. This one was thicker, with a more elaborate design. The engraving inside was different, bearing another man's name and a date just a few years before Meghan had met him. Harry's hand trembled slightly as he held them. The air in the room seemed to shift, becoming heavier, pressing in on him. 2 rings, 2 names, 2 dates, neither connected to him in any way. He placed them back into his palm and stared, his mind racing through every conversation they'd had about her past. She had mentioned a previous marriage before, one to a film producer. It had been public knowledge, something she never tried to hide. But these were not from that marriage. These were new to him, and the dates told a different story entirely. A part of him wanted to put the rings back in the pouch, tuck them away, and pretend he had never seen them. After all, what good could come from dredging up something she had chosen to keep hidden? But another part of him, the part that had endured years of public scrutiny, betrayals from people he trusted, and the sting of half-truths, knew that once you see something like this, you cannot unsee it. He sat down on the edge of the bed, the ring still in his hand, and stared at the floor. His thoughts shifted rapidly from disbelief to suspicion, to a gnawing sense of betrayal. If she had kept this from him, what else was she capable of hiding? The sound of the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway seemed unnervingly loud, each second stretching the moment further. Memories of their early days together flooded his mind. The whirlwind romance, the passionate speeches about trust and transparency, the insistence that they would always be honest with each other, no matter what. He remembered how Meghan had told him that their relationship was different because they were both outsiders in their own way, that they would never have to play games with one another. And now, here he was, staring at evidence that suggested otherwise. The afternoon sun shifted, casting new shadows across the room. Harry closed the jewelry box slowly, but kept the rings in his pocket. He didn't know why he did it. Perhaps a subconscious need to hold on to them until he could make sense of what they meant. He stood, pacing the room, trying to suppress the rush of questions crowding his mind. Why were these rings hidden here? Who were these men? Were these marriages real, or symbolic in some way? And if they were real, why had Meghan never told him? By the time he left the bedroom, the air of calm that had filled the house earlier was gone. The rooms felt colder, emptier. Every familiar object now seemed to carry the weight of potential deception. He walked down the hall, his footsteps echoing louder than usual, as though the house itself knew something had shifted. The rest of the day passed in a haze. Harry avoided phone calls, didn't answer messages, and barely ate. His mind kept looping back to the moment he opened the pouch. He tried to imagine the stories behind those rings, and every scenario led him down a darker path. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that the discovery wasn't just about the rings. It was about the possibility that the person he thought he knew best was someone else entirely. By nightfall, the decision was made. He would have to find out the truth. But he also knew that whatever he learned could change everything. Not just for their marriage, but for the life they had built together, the image they presented to the world, and the trust that had once been the foundation of it all. And as he lay in bed that night, unable to sleep, Harry couldn't shake the feeling that the real shock was yet to come. The morning had started like so many others in Montecito, with the sun rising over the distant hills and casting a warm golden glow across the Sussex estate. The air carried the faint scent of eucalyptus and the rhythmic sound of waves crashing somewhere beyond the horizon. Harry had woken earlier than usual, not because of any pressing engagement, but because his mind had been restless. It wasn't an uncommon occurrence lately. Life in California was meant to be an escape, a sanctuary from the relentless pressures of royal duty, the tabloid frenzy, and the political maneuvering of the monarchy. Here, they could choose what to reveal and what to hide, dictate their schedules, and finally live on their own terms. Yet beneath the sunshine and the manicured gardens, there had been an undercurrent of tension building in the household. It wasn't the kind of explosive tension that erupts in shouting matches. It was quieter, more subtle, the kind that lingers and pauses during conversation and in the way two people move around each other without meeting eyes. Harry noticed it in small things. Meghan had been spending more time away, attending private meetings or weekend retreats that were often vaguely explained. Her phone was never far from her hand, and she sometimes stepped into another room to take calls, her voice dropping low. When he asked about them, she answered quickly, then changed the subject. There was nothing overtly suspicious. After all, Meghan had a public image to manage, business deals in motion, and charity work that took her in many directions. Still, Harry couldn't shake the feeling that there was a growing space between them, one that no amount of carefully staged public appearances could close. That morning, Harry wandered through the garden before breakfast, hands in his pockets, his thoughts circling the same unspoken questions. The flowers Meghan had planted last spring were in full bloom, bursts of pink, white, and lavender lining the stone paths. Bees hummed lazily between blossoms, indifferent to the world's dramas. For a moment, the peace of it all calmed him, and he tried to convince himself that his concerns were unfounded. Marriage, after all, wasn't immune to seasons of distance. He returned inside, pouring himself a cup of coffee in the kitchen. The quiet was unusual. Meghan had already left for her meeting, leaving only a note on the counter in her elegant, looping handwriting. It was simple, affectionate, but also vague, just a reminder she'd be home later in the evening. Harry read it twice before tucking it under a coaster. With no pressing engagements, he decided to spend the day at home. The estate was large, and he rarely took the time to explore it beyond the main living spaces. There were rooms still filled with unopened boxes from their move, corners where dust settled undisturbed, and spaces that felt more like storage than home. He wandered from room to room, occasionally stopping to examine framed photos, books stacked in uneven piles, and small mementos collected from their travels. It was during this aimless exploration that he found himself standing in the doorway of their bedroom. The curtains were drawn just enough to let in slants of soft morning light. The bed was neatly made, the throw pillows arranged in a way Meghan preferred, symmetrical and precise. The scent of her perfume lingered faintly in the air, mingling with the smell of fresh laundry. Harry's eyes roamed over the familiar details. Her vanity with its array of makeup brushes and compacts, the neatly arranged perfume bottles, the framed black and white photo of the two of them from their engagement period. Everything was in its place, except for one small thing. The jewelry box on the dressing table sat slightly askew, the latch undone. At first, he thought nothing of it. Meghan often left it open when choosing accessories for an event. But today, with the house so quiet and the air so still, the sight of it seemed oddly significant. He stepped closer, the soft carpet muffling his footsteps. The jewelry box was unlike anything else she owned, handcrafted from walnut. Its wood so dark it was almost black in certain light. The lid bore her initials in a small brass plate, and the edges were inlaid with an intricate floral pattern. It was an object that demanded care. One didn't simply toss it around or leave it unguarded. Harry ran his fingers lightly over the surface, feeling the smoothness of the polish and the faint ridges of the carved design. It was cool to the touch, as if it had been sitting untouched for hours. The latch clicked softly as he lifted it, revealing the familiar arrangement of compartments lined in deep red velvet. The top layer held pieces he recognized, the diamond earrings she'd worn to the Commonwealth Day service, a delicate bracelet he had given her on their first wedding anniversary, and a few rings that had appeared in countless photographs. They glimmered in the filtered light, each carrying a memory he could place. But as he gently shifted one of the compartments aside, he noticed a section beneath it, a hidden tier he hadn't seen before. It wasn't locked, but the fit was snug, as if meant to discourage casual exploration. He hesitated for a moment, telling himself it was none of his business. Then, almost without thinking, he slid it open. What he saw inside didn't immediately register. There was a folded silk handkerchief, its edges yellowed slightly with age, and beneath it, a small velvet pouch. It was the kind of pouch jewelers use, but this one looked worn, as though it had been handled often in the past, and then left untouched for years. He picked it up, feeling the unexpected weight of whatever was inside. Loosening the drawstring, he tipped the contents into his palm, and two gold rings slid out, their surfaces catching the light. They weren't ornate or flashy. They were simple, the kind chosen for their meaning rather than their price. Harry's brow furrowed as he examined the first one. The inside was engraved with a man's name and a date. The name was unfamiliar, the date predating their relationship by several years. The second ring was slightly thicker, the engraving inside revealing another man's name and a different date, this one only a couple of years before they met. For a long moment, he just stood there, the rings in his open palm, listening to the sound of his own breathing. The realization was slow but unrelenting. These were wedding rings, each tied to a marriage he had never been told about. The quiet calm of the morning shattered in that instant. The birds outside still sang. The sun still streamed through the curtains, but the peace had vanished. The air in the room felt heavier, and the warmth of the day seemed suddenly distant. Harry closed his hand around the rings, the metal cold against his skin, and sat on the edge of the bed. 1,000 thoughts surged through his mind. Why had she hidden them? Who were these men? Why had she never spoken of them? The Meghan he knew, or thought he knew, had always insisted on transparency between them. They had agreed to be each other's safe space, to share even the most difficult truths. This was not a difficult truth. This was a buried one. He placed the rings back into the pouch, but instead of returning it to the jewelry box, he slipped it into his pocket. His hands felt unsteady, his heartbeat quickening. He didn't yet know what he would do, but he knew that nothing about this day would be ordinary again. As he left the room, he cast one last glance at the jewelry box, now closed but no longer just a simple container of personal treasures. To him, it had become a vault of secrets, and he had only just begun to unlock what lay inside. By the time he reached the kitchen again, The coffee in his mug had gone cold. The calm before the storm had ended, though he didn't yet realize just how fierce that storm would be. The jewelry box had always been a fixture in their bedroom, yet it somehow seemed invisible until that day. It wasn't hidden away in a closet or locked in a safe. It sat openly on the dressing table, its presence as unremarkable as a lamp or a framed photograph. But for Harry, the moment he saw it sitting there with the latch undone, it took on a new gravity. It was a striking piece of craftsmanship, unlike anything else in the room. Made from deep walnut wood, its surface was so perfectly polished that the morning light slid across it like water. The edges were adorned with delicate inlays of mother-of-pearl in an intricate floral motif, the kind of detail that suggested it was the work of an artisan, not a factory. Each petal and vine seemed to have been carved with intent, the design flowing around the box like a living pattern. The brass plate on the lid bore Meghan's initials in an elegant serif font, the metal aged just enough to give it character without diminishing its sheen. Harry remembered the first time he had noticed it after they moved into the Montecito estate. Meghan had mentioned it briefly, calling it an old keepsake from before we met. At the time, he hadn't thought to ask more. In the early days of their marriage, he had taken her words at face value. There was no reason to doubt her, no reason to pry into every object that belonged to her past. But now, standing over it, he realized he had never once seen her open it in his presence. He had seen her take jewelry from other cases, small pouches, or boxes that looked newer and more ordinary. This one, however, always seemed to remain closed, its contents unseen. The latch clicked softly under his fingers, and the lid lifted with a smoothness that spoke of careful upkeep. A faint scent rose from inside, a blend of aged wood, old fabric, and the lingering whisper of her perfume. It was the smell of something that had been stored and guarded for years, not casually tossed about. Inside, the layout was precise and organized. The upper tray was divided into sections, each holding pieces he recognized. There were the pearl drop earrings she had worn on their tour of Australia, the delicate gold bracelet she favored for casual outings, and a ring with a small emerald they had picked up during a trip to Botswana. Every item seemed to carry a memory he could pinpoint, and for a brief moment, his guard lowered. But as his eyes swept the tray, he noticed a fine layer of dust collecting along the edge of one compartment, a strange detail in an otherwise immaculate arrangement. It suggested that not everything in this box was touched regularly. His gaze lingered on a small notch along the side, almost imperceptible unless one knew where to look. On impulse, he pressed it lightly, and the upper tray shifted, revealing a hidden lower compartment. This second layer was lined in deeper, richer velvet, its color bordering on burgundy. It contained fewer items, but each seemed older, more personal. A folded silk handkerchief lay in the center, its once crisp fabric softened by time. Beneath it rested a velvet pouch, the kind of container that promised something of value inside. The pouch's color had faded slightly, its drawstring frayed at the ends, and the fabric bore the kind of wear that only comes from years of being handled and tucked away again. Harry's fingers hesitated before touching it. The weight of curiosity pressed against his restraint. He told himself he should close the box and leave it alone. This was her private space, her private history. But the undone latch, the unlocked compartment, and the way the pouch seemed to be waiting there broke down that boundary. He picked it up. It was heavier than he expected, and the shape of the objects inside shifted slightly with the movement. Loosening the drawstring, he tipped the contents into his palm. 2 rings rolled out, catching the light as they settled in his hand. At first glance, they were simple, gold bands, unadorned by gemstones, their designs understated. But the simplicity only made them more striking. These weren't decorative accessories. They were symbols, chosen for meaning over flash. He turned the first one over, and that's when he saw it, an engraving on the inner surface. The letters were small but sharp, preserved as though the ring had been worn for years but cared for meticulously. A man's name, a date. The name was unfamiliar, and the date was from over a decade ago, years before Meghan had met him, years before their lives had intersected. He picked up the second ring, heavier and slightly thicker. This one bore a different name and another date, one that sat uncomfortably close to the time they had first crossed paths. The room seemed to shrink around him as he stared at them. His heartbeat was loud in his ears, and a faint buzzing filled the edges of his thoughts. These weren't keepsakes from a family member. These weren't props from a film roll. They were wedding rings, each tied to a commitment, a vow, and a life lived with someone else. Why would she keep them? Why here, in the place they shared? And why had she never said a word? Harry's instinct was to search for context. He glanced back into the compartment, looking for any accompanying notes, photographs, or mementos that might explain them. There was nothing else. Only the handkerchief and the empty velvet that had cradled the pouch. The absence of explanation made the discovery feel heavier, more deliberate. He placed the rings back into the pouch, but didn't return them to the jewelry box. Instead, he closed the box slowly, his eyes lingering on the brass plate with her initials. The box, beautiful as it was, now felt less like a piece of art and more like a locked diary, one whose pages he had just begun to read. He slipped the pouch into his pocket. The metal felt cold against his leg, a constant reminder that he was carrying something he was never meant to see. As he walked away from the dressing table, he found himself glancing back, as though expecting the box to vanish or lock itself again. Downstairs, the normalcy of the house felt hollow. The hum of the refrigerator, the muted ticking of the grandfather clock, the filtered sunlight, all of it seemed untouched by the weight of what he now knew, yet the weight pressed on him nonetheless. Harry had always believed that the strength of their relationship lay in their willingness to share truths, even when they were uncomfortable. But the jewelry box had just revealed a truth Meghan had chosen not to share, and it was a truth that could not be brushed aside. He leaned against the kitchen counter, fingers brushing the outline of the pouch in his pocket. He didn't know what the next step would be, but he knew the moment he lifted that lid, his life had shifted. The jewelry box was no longer just a container of adornments. It was a silent witness to a part of Meghan's life he had never been allowed to see, and now that he had glimpsed it, he couldn't look away. Harry remained in the kitchen for a long time, the quiet of the house wrapping around him like a suffocating blanket. His coffee sat untouched, its surface now cold and dark, but his mind was too entangled to care. The pouch in his pocket felt impossibly heavy for something so small. He had touched many priceless things in his life: medals, ancient royal heirlooms, artifacts handled with gloves, but this was different. This was intimate, personal, charged with a meaning he couldn't yet name. Eventually, he pulled out the pouch again and emptied the 2 rings onto the smooth marble counter. This time, his focus narrowed to the first one. It lay still under the kitchen light, its simple gold surface catching the occasional glint. There was nothing extravagant about it, yet it radiated a quiet gravity. Rings like this weren't chosen for show, they were chosen for the life they were meant to represent. He picked it up between his thumb and forefinger, holding it close to examine the engraving inside. The name was unfamiliar, a short, strong name that sounded old-fashioned. Below it, a date was neatly inscribed in clean, serif letters. The date stopped him cold. It was from more than 10 years ago, a time when Meghan was still working her way through Hollywood, long before she'd crossed paths with him, long before her name was tied to any royal scandal or title. Harry's mind began constructing images without his consent. He pictured Meghan in a white dress. Not the Givenchy gown from their wedding, but something simpler, less publicized. He imagined her standing beside a man whose face he couldn't see, in a setting far from palaces or televised ceremonies. Somewhere quiet, somewhere unrecorded. He tried to push the images away, but they clung stubbornly to the edges of his mind. The questions came quickly, tumbling over each other. Who was this man? Where had the wedding taken place? How long had it lasted? Why had she never mentioned it? He had known about her marriage to the film producer. It had been public knowledge and part of the narrative she openly shared. But this wasn't in any interview, biography, or conversation. This was a chapter she had kept sealed. He turned the ring over again, feeling the subtle wear along the band, the faint smoothing that only comes from daily use over years. This wasn't a token kept in a drawer. This had been worn, lived in. The metal carried a silent history of moments. Hands held, arguments had, decisions made together. It was, in essence, a witness to a life he had no part in. Harry's stomach tightened. He had spent much of his adult life in the public eye, where nearly every detail of his relationships was dissected. He'd been careful, guarded, because trust was precious and fragile. When Meghan came into his life, she had insisted they could be honest in ways they couldn't be with the outside world. But staring at this ring, he wondered if that honesty had ever been complete. His thoughts drifted to the early days of their courtship, the long conversations that stretched into the night. They had shared personal histories, past relationships, lessons learned. Or at least, he had. Meghan's accounts of her own past had been vivid but selective, shaped in a way that painted her as someone who had endured, grown, and moved forward without lingering shadows. The man behind this ring was a shadow. He turned toward the study, where he kept his laptop. If there was one thing Harry had learned from years of relentless tabloid intrusion, it was that the internet never truly forgot. Somewhere, buried deep enough to evade casual searches, there might be a record of this marriage. Not the gossip columns. Those were unreliable at best, but official records, archived announcements, or small-town news clippings. He typed the name from the engraving into the search bar, pairing it with Meghan's maiden name. At first, nothing of substance came up, just scattered results for people with similar names, irrelevant business listings, and a few generic social media profiles. But Harry wasn't in a hurry. He refined the search, adding the date, narrowing the locations, filtering through old newspaper archives. Then, a headline from a little-known local paper caught his eye. It wasn't sensational, just a short announcement, tucked away in the back pages of a 2010 edition. The wording was plain: Mr. Name and MS. Meghan Markle were joined in a private ceremony last Saturday, attended by close friends and family. There was no photo, no elaborate write-up, just a single paragraph marking the event. Harry read it 3 times, each time feeling the same cold weight settle in his chest. This wasn't rumor or speculation. This was a matter of record. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the screen. The paper was from a small coastal town in Northern California, the kind of place where people valued privacy over spectacle. It made sense. If she had wanted to keep it quiet, she would have chosen a location where few eyes could pry. But what didn't make sense was why she had never told him, not even in passing. His mind returned to the day they got engaged, how they had spoken about starting their life together with no secrets, no skeletons rattling in the corners of their pasts. He remembered her smiling, squeezing his hand, assuring him that everything that mattered was already on the table. At the time, he had believed her without hesitation. Now, with the ring still in his hand, belief felt like a fragile thing. He tried to imagine how he would even bring this up. Would he confront her directly? Wait for her to offer an explanation? What if she denied it? The thought of her looking him in the eye and dismissing the evidence in his hand made his chest tighten. The house was still quiet. Outside, the late morning sun had climbed higher, spilling light across the garden. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked. The normalcy of the world around him felt almost mocking, as though everything was moving forward while he stood frozen in a moment he hadn't asked for. Harry placed the first ring back into the pouch and set it beside the second. 2 rings, 2 names, 2 timelines. This one, the first, was now etched into his mind not just as an object, but as a story he had only begun to uncover. Whatever the truth was, it was clear that the jewelry box had not just given him a glimpse of Meghan's past. It had opened a door to it. And he wasn't sure yet whether stepping through would lead to clarity or something far more damaging. One thing he knew for certain: he couldn't unsee what he had found. Harry sat in silence for several minutes after placing the first ring back into the pouch. The air in the kitchen seemed thicker, heavier, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. He kept his gaze fixed on the second ring lying alone on the counter, its subtle shine catching the light in a way that felt almost taunting. This one was different. Even at a glance, it carried a more deliberate presence. It was slightly wider than the first, with a brushed gold finish that softened its reflection, giving it an understated but refined look. While the first ring had been simple to the point of humility, this one had a certain weight and polish. The kind chosen when someone wants a piece to feel permanent, unyielding. Harry reached for it, rolling it slowly between his fingers. The metal was cool, its texture smooth except for the faint groove of the engraving inside. As he tilted it toward the light, the letters revealed themselves. Another name, entirely different from the first, and another date. The sight of it made his stomach tighten again. This date was closer, alarmingly close. It wasn't a decade ago like the first. It wasn't ancient history. This one fell just a few short years before they met, sitting uncomfortably in the overlap of her public rise and her private life. It was recent enough that he could almost trace her movements during that time, remember interviews she'd given, events she'd attended. And yet this man's name had never once crossed her lips in all the time they'd been together. The proximity of the date to their meeting unsettled him more than the first ring had. The first could be chalked up to youthful decisions, a life before him that she might have wanted to keep compartmentalized. But this one edged dangerously close to the beginning of their story. His mind immediately started building timelines, trying to reconcile what he knew about her life then with the existence of this marriage. Was she still connected to this man when they first met? Had there been overlap? Had their relationship begun while this one was ending? The questions weren't idle curiosities. They cut straight to the foundation of trust. He thought about the whirlwind of their early relationship, the way everything had accelerated so quickly, from the first date to the secret getaways, to introducing her to his inner circle. He'd assumed they were two people finding each other at exactly the right time. But now, looking at this ring, he wondered if he'd stepped into her life at a crossroads he'd never been told about. He turned to his laptop again. The name inside the second ring was less common than the first, which made the search easier. Within minutes, he was staring at a trail of digital breadcrumbs, old business records, social media posts, and a few scattered mentions in event write-ups. The man was older than Meghan, a businessman with a modest but successful career in the tech sector. The most telling discovery came from an archived wedding registry, still lurking on a forgotten corner of the internet. It listed Meghan's name beside his, the date matching the engraving inside the ring. The registry wasn't lavish. It was practical, with requests for items like cookware, linens, and home essentials. There were even a few personalized items, like monogram towels. Harry scrolled through it slowly, the normalcy of it somehow making it worse. This wasn't just a fleeting romance. It had been a union planned with intention, grounded in the idea of building a life together. There were no press clippings about the marriage, no splashy photographs. It was clear they'd kept it private, much like the first one. But the absence of public record didn't lessen its significance. It only made Harry question how much effort had gone into keeping it hidden. He thought back to conversations they'd had about her past relationships. Meghan had always been careful with her words, framing her past as a series of stepping stones that had led her to him. She spoke of heartbreaks and lessons learned, but never in specifics that could be pinned to a timeline. At the time, he'd admired her ability to speak openly while still maintaining her dignity. Now, it felt like she had been curating the narrative all along. The brushed gold surface of the ring seemed to hold its own quiet defiance, as though it knew it didn't belong in the shadows. Harry wondered how many times Meghan had taken it out of the pouch, held it, perhaps even slipped it on her finger in moments of solitude. The thought was unsettling, a silent reminder of a life she'd chosen to keep parallel to their own. He set the ring down beside the first, the two of them forming a pair that told a story he wasn't ready to hear in full. Together, they were like coordinates on a map, marking points in a journey he hadn't been invited to travel. Harry leaned back, running a hand over his face. His instinct wasn't to explode or accuse, not yet. He needed to understand. The problem was that understanding might come with truths he wasn't prepared for. If the first ring had cracked the surface of his trust, the second had driven a fault line straight through it. He picked it up one more time, reading the engraving again, committing the name and date to memory. Then he placed both rings back into the pouch and tightened the drawstring. He slipped it into his pocket once more, feeling its weight press against him as he stood. The house felt different now. Every room seemed to echo, every familiar object a little less innocent. Even the sunlight streaming through the windows felt too bright, too revealing. Harry knew this discovery wasn't something he could ignore, but he also knew that rushing into confrontation would yield nothing but defensiveness. He would need to approach this carefully, to gather every piece of information before taking it to her. Because once he did, there would be no going back. And deep down, he feared that the second ring might not just be a piece of her past. It might be the key to understanding everything she'd been keeping from him. Harry didn't immediately storm into a confrontation. Years in the public eye had taught him that the first reaction was rarely the right one. What he needed now wasn't an emotional outburst. It was information. Cold, Factual, undeniable information. And if there was one thing he knew, it was that once a trail existed, no matter how faint, it could be followed. He took the pouch from his pocket again, setting it gently on the desk in his study. The rings lay inside, silent and still, but they seemed to radiate questions. The names engraved within them weren't just identifiers, they were starting points. Each was a door to a part of Meghan's life he had never been allowed to enter. Harry opened his laptop, the glow of the screen breaking the dim quiet of the room. He typed the first name into a search engine, pairing it with Meghan's maiden name again. But this time, he widened his approach. He used advanced search filters, scanned cache pages, and dove into public record databases. It was meticulous work, the kind that felt more like an investigation than idle curiosity. With the first name, results were sparse but telling. That small-town newspaper announcement he had found earlier now seemed more significant in light of other fragments. A property deed jointly held for a short period. A mention in an old community fundraiser program where Meghan's name appeared beside his. There were no public divorce records visible online, but that didn't mean they didn't exist. The second name, however, produced a thicker digital trail. The man had a LinkedIn profile, though it hadn't been updated in several years. Harry found corporate filings showing the man's connection to a mid-sized tech firm. There were archived event pages where the man had been photographed at industry gatherings, usually standing in the background rather than in the spotlight. Then came the more personal traces, fragments of social media posts from people in his network. One in particular made Harry's pulse quicken. It was an old Instagram post, years old, of a group at what looked like a wedding reception. The caption was generic, "Beautiful night celebrating love," but in the blurry background, he could make out Meghan's unmistakable silhouette. The dress she wore was not one he recognized, nor was the setting. She wasn't posing for the camera. She was in motion, talking to someone just outside the frame. Harry saved the image, studying it closely. It didn't confirm anything by itself, but it was another puzzle piece. The timeline matched the engraving in the second ring. He pushed further, searching court records by county. In one jurisdiction, a document surfaced, a marriage license issued to Meghan Markle and the second man's name. It wasn't easily found. It was buried deep, a scanned PDF among thousands of records. But there it was, in plain type, the date matching the one on the ring. There was no corresponding divorce decree in the same jurisdiction, which meant it had either been filed elsewhere or not filed at all. The implication made him pause. If the paperwork to dissolve that marriage had been delayed or handled in another state, the overlap with their relationship could be more complicated than he wanted to imagine. He sat back in his chair, staring at the screen. The study was silent except for the occasional creak of the old wooden floor as the house settled. He thought about the press. How relentless they had been with him for decades. How they could turn a whisper into a headline overnight. If they ever found what he was finding now, the consequences would be devastating. But for Harry, the public fallout wasn't the sharpest edge of this discovery. The personal betrayal was. They had built their life on the idea that they were united against the outside world. If she had kept something of this magnitude hidden, then what else was locked away? He closed the laptop for a moment, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees, pressing his hands together. Confronting her now, with only partial information, would give her room to deny or redirect. He needed more, enough that her only options would be to tell the truth or to remain silent under the weight of it. He reached for his phone, scrolling through his contacts until he landed on one he hadn't used in years, a former security consultant he trusted implicitly. The man had been with the Royal Security Detail for a time, but had left to run his own discreet investigative firm. If anyone could discreetly confirm marriage and divorce records, it was him. "Harry," the man answered after 2 rings, his voice steady but surprised. "It's been a while. I need your help," Harry said, choosing his words carefully. "And I need it to be absolutely confidential. No one, and I mean no one, outside of you can know about this." There was a pause on the other end. "You have my word. What's going on?" Harry didn't give names over the phone. He simply explained that he needed verification of certain marriage records and their dissolution, as well as any other legal filings tied to them. The man didn't press for details. He just asked for the basic information he would need to begin the search. After ending the call, Harry felt a mix of relief and dread. Relief, because he knew the information would be accurate. dread, because he also knew he might not like what came back. The rest of the day passed in uneasy increments. He avoided the parts of the house where Meghan's things were most visible, not wanting to trigger another wave of questions in his mind. Instead, he busied himself with small, mechanical tasks, reorganizing a bookshelf, walking the dogs, replying to emails. But every so often, his hand would brush against the pouch in his pocket, and the weight of it would remind him that all these distractions were temporary. Late in the evening, his phone buzzed with a secure message from the investigator. He opened it, his eyes scanning quickly. Both marriages were confirmed. Both were legally ended, but the second had been dissolved only a matter of weeks before Meghan and Harry's relationship had become public knowledge. The timeline was razor thin. Harry stared at the message until the words blurred. Weeks. Not years, not months, weeks. That meant when they had first started seeing each other, she had still been, in legal terms, another man's wife. He set the phone down slowly, his mind reeling. Every memory from that period now carried a new shadow. He thought about their first trip together, the first time she met his friends, the first interview where he had spoken about her publicly. In each of those moments, there had been a truth just outside his view. The search for answers had given him clarity, but it had also deepened the wound. There was no going back to the ignorance of the morning. The only thing left now was to decide how, and when, to confront her. And as he sat alone in the dim light of the study, Harry knew that whatever happened next would change the course of their marriage forever. The first name in the engraving on that worn gold band kept repeating in Harry's head like a low drumbeat. It was the less recent of the two marriages, but in many ways, that made it more haunting. This wasn't some quick, impulsive fling from her youth. The more he dug into it, the more it looked like a formative relationship, one that had been quietly erased from her public story. Harry knew he couldn't piece the truth together from scattered records alone. To understand the significance, he needed to see the man not just as a name on paper, but as a person who had shared a chapter of Meghan's life. The investigator's report had been thorough. The man, whose name he now knew by heart, was from a small coastal town in Northern California. He had never been in the public eye, never courted fame, and by all accounts, had lived a grounded, unpretentious life. The first confirmed record of them together was a marriage license dated just over a decade ago. The ceremony itself had been small, almost intimate, just a few friends and family. No lavish venue, no celebrity guest list, no media coverage. The setting had been a private estate overlooking the ocean, a place where the sound of the waves would have drowned out any hint of the outside world. Harry could picture it. The salt air, the golden light of a late afternoon, the quiet confidence of two people believing they were making a forever promise. The investigator had also uncovered something Harry hadn't expected. Meghan and her first secret husband had lived together for nearly 3 years. It wasn't a whirlwind romance that burned out quickly. It had longevity. They had rented a modest 2-story house, split utility bills, hosted dinner parties for neighbors. There were receipts for joint purchases, furniture, appliances, even a used SUV they had bought together. It was, in every sense, a marriage. There were no public signs of turmoil in those years, but the divorce records hinted at a slow unraveling. The official filing cited irreconcilable differences, the catch-all phrase that often masks 100 private truths. No contested property disputes, no drawn-out legal battles, just a quiet dissolution, as if both parties had agreed it was time to part without fireworks. Harry sat with this information, trying to reconcile it with the woman he knew. Meghan had always spoken of her first publicly acknowledged marriage, to the Hollywood producer, with a certain openness. She had been willing to let the world know about that chapter. But this one, it had been buried entirely, even from him. Why? The more he thought about it, the more he realized that the decision to hide it couldn't have been about the man's fame. He had none. It wasn't about scandal. There was no sign of infidelity or betrayal on either side. It was almost as though she had decided, at some point, to edit this marriage out of her life altogether. Harry imagined the conversations they could have had if she'd told him. He imagined asking about what she'd learned from it, how it had shaped her views on commitment, on love, on trust. But those conversations had never happened. And now, learning about it like this, those questions felt poisoned by the secrecy. The investigator had even managed to speak to someone who knew them both back then, a former neighbor, now living in another state. According to the neighbor, Meghan and her first secret husband had seemed genuinely happy in the early days. She described seeing them gardening together, walking their dog in the evenings, laughing over drinks on the porch. But over time, the laughter had grown less frequent, the walks less regular. It was like they started living parallel lives under the same roof, the neighbor had said. Harry found himself picturing those evenings, the slow fade of connection, the quiet acceptance that something once bright had dimmed. He knew from his own life how that kind of distance could creep in without fanfare, until one day you look across the room at someone you love and realize you're on different islands. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that the concealment of this marriage was deliberate in a way that went beyond embarrassment or irrelevance. Meghan was media-savvy, detail-conscious to the extreme. She knew the power of narrative, of how each detail added or removed could shape how she was perceived. To have kept this hidden from him suggested not just omission, but strategy. He turned the ring over in his hand again. The surface was worn, the gold softened by years of friction against skin. Whoever this man was, he had been part of her life in a way that left a physical imprint on this band. Harry wondered if Meghan had ever opened the pouch to hold it again, to remember, or to remind herself of what she'd chosen to leave behind. One thing was clear. This first secret husband wasn't some nameless ghost. He was a real man with a real history with her, and Harry now had more than enough to find him if he chose to. But the question gnawed at him. Did he want to? The urge to confront the past was strong, but so was the awareness that digging too far could uncover more than he was ready to face. Still, the ring was already in his possession, and the truth, once glimpsed, could not be unseen. By the time Harry left the study that night, the image of Meghan standing on that cliffside estate a decade ago, slipping this very ring onto her finger, had taken root in his mind, and it wasn't going anywhere. The second ring was the one that refused to leave Harry's thoughts. If the first marriage had been a relic from a distant past, this one was alarmingly close. Close enough to overlap with the time he had first begun to know her. The brushed gold band in his possession wasn't worn smooth by decades, but by a handful of years, perhaps less. Its engraving carried not only another man's name, but a date that unsettled him more every time he considered it. The investigator's report on this second man painted a portrait very different from the first. This wasn't a small-town figure living quietly by the sea. The man was part of the tech world, an entrepreneur with a string of mid-sized ventures to his name. He moved between California and Europe for business, owned properties in both, and was connected to a wide network of industry peers. His life, while not tabloid fodder, was one of movement, deals, and high-end networking. The kind of environment where Meghan had been known to navigate with ease. The marriage record was clean, straightforward, and indisputable. It had been issued in a California county not far from Los Angeles, the ceremony taking place at a private venue known for its exclusivity. The guest list was small but carefully curated: business associates, a few personal friends, no paparazzi. It wasn't meant to be public. What stood out most in the report, however, was the dissolution date. The divorce had been finalized only weeks before Harry and Meghan had made their relationship public. The narrowness of that gap could not be explained away easily. There was no time for long separations, no lengthy cooling-off period, just a sudden legal severance followed by the start of a new, high-profile romance. Harry tried to place himself in that timeline. He remembered the first time they had been spotted together by the press, the speculation, the feverish coverage. Back then, he believed they were beginning their story on clear ground. Now, it seemed as though that beginning might have been someone else's ending. The report also contained fragments that made the connection between Meghan and the second husband seem less like a fleeting encounter and more like a serious commitment. There was a jointly leased property in West Hollywood, an imported sports car registered in both their names, and even a travel itinerary for a 3-week trip to Italy less than a year before the divorce. The destinations weren't random: Rome, Venice, Florence, all places steeped in romance, the kind of trip a couple takes when they believe they're solid. There were whispers too, subtle but telling. An old social media post from a mutual friend, congratulating them on making it official, accompanied by a blurred photo of what appeared to be the wedding venue. A now-deleted LinkedIn update from the man himself, thanking his partner for supporting a major business milestone. None of it screamed scandal, but together, the pieces wove a narrative of a life lived together, a life that had ended abruptly, without public explanation. Harry couldn't help but think about how close this man's life had run alongside his own. While Harry was attending royal engagements, dealing with the press, and quietly building a connection with Meghan, this man had been legally bound to her. The overlap gnawed at him. The investigator had managed to get a brief comment from a source described as familiar with the marriage. The source's words were cautious but telling. They were good together at first, very aligned. But she had bigger ambitions, and he was starting to settle. It wasn't explosive, but you could see the difference in their paths. That line, bigger ambitions, echoed in Harry's head. He had seen Meghan's drive firsthand, her ability to focus on a goal and move toward it with precision. It was a quality he had admired, even envied. But in the context of this hidden marriage, it carried a sharper edge. Harry thought about the ring itself. The brushed finish, the slight weight to it, the way it seemed intentionally designed to be subtle yet significant. It wasn't the kind of ring you forgot about, the kind you tossed into a drawer without thought. It was chosen with care, meant to last. And yet here it was, hidden in a velvet pouch in a jewelry box she kept closed around him. He couldn't decide what disturbed him more, the fact that the marriage had existed at all or the fact that she had chosen to keep the ring. If it was over, why keep the physical reminder? Why place it alongside another wedding band from another hidden chapter? As with the first husband, Harry now had enough information to find the man if he chose to. He could picture the confrontation. A quiet meeting in some neutral place, a frank conversation about timelines and truths. But he also knew that stepping into that territory risked detonating something he might not be able to contain. Still, the proximity of the dates, the intertwining of lives, and the fact that their own story began in the shadow of this one left him with no illusions. This second husband wasn't just a footnote. He was part of the prologue to Harry's own life with Meghan. By the time he closed the report and placed the ring back into the pouch, the shape of the problem had become clearer. The two rings weren't just symbols of past commitments. They were markers on a map that connected to the present. And the closer he looked, the more he realized that Meghan's carefully curated past was less a straight path and more a series of closed doors he'd never been invited to open. The difference now was that he had the keys. Harry had been through plenty of emotional storms in his life. The loss of his mother, the unrelenting glare of the media, the public strain with his family, but this was different. This was an earthquake that started in his own home, in the quiet space where he was supposed to feel safest. And the aftershocks weren't letting up. He sat in the dim light of the study long after he had finished reading the investigators' reports, the pouch of rings resting on the desk like a loaded weapon. His mind kept looping through the same sequence. The day he met Meghan, their whirlwind courtship, the speeches about honesty and partnership, the vows exchanged under the eyes of the world. Each memory now carried an intrusive shadow, whispering that there had been a parallel reality he'd known nothing about. Sleep didn't come easily that night. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the room silent except for the distant hum of the refrigerator downstairs. Every time he closed his eyes, the faces of two men he'd never met floated up in his mind. One from a decade ago, one from just before his own chapter with Meghan began. He didn't know what they looked like exactly, but the names were enough to conjure the sense of them, the weight they now had in his life without ever stepping into it. By morning, the emotional strain had begun to shift from shock to something heavier. Betrayal had a way of settling into the bones, making every movement feel slower, every thought more labored. Harry found himself avoiding the bedroom entirely, as if simply walking past the dressing table might undo whatever composure he was clinging to. The questions that circled in his mind weren't simple ones. It wasn't just, why didn't she tell me? It was, what does this say about the foundation of everything we've built? Trust, once cracked, never seemed to return to its original shape. And this wasn't a small crack. It was a fracture running through years of shared history. Harry tried to approach it rationally. He told himself there might be explanations he hadn't considered. Maybe she had thought these marriages were irrelevant to their present life. Maybe she had been protecting him from unnecessary complications. But even the most generous explanations didn't erase the fact that she had kept not one, but 2 entire marriages out of sight. He replayed their earliest conversations in his mind, searching for moments when she might have been on the verge of telling him. Had she paused once or twice, hesitated before answering a question about her past? He remembered the way she had framed her life before him, a series of experiences that had made her stronger, wiser, ready for the commitment they now shared. It had been a compelling story, one he had believed without hesitation. Now, it felt like he had been reading the abridged version while the full manuscript remained locked away. The emotional fallout began to seep into other parts of his day. He found himself distracted during phone calls, unable to focus on work. Even mundane tasks, feeding the dogs, making tea, carried a strange detachment. It was as if the house itself had changed character, its familiar spaces now colored by the knowledge of what had been hidden there. The worst moments were the flashes of doubt about his own judgment. He had prided himself on knowing people, on reading their intentions clearly. It was a skill honed out of necessity in his position, the ability to tell friend from opportunist, ally from enemy. If he had missed something this significant in his own marriage, what else had he failed to see? He didn't tell anyone what he had found, not yet. The idea of bringing it to friends or family felt dangerous. Too many people already stood ready to dissect their relationship, to pounce on any perceived weakness. Once this truth was out, there would be no controlling it. Instead, he carried it with him like a secret illness. In public, nothing looked different. He smiled when expected, spoke with the same measured warmth. But in private, the weight pressed harder. The rings were no longer just in the pouch. They were in his pocket more often than not, a physical reminder he could feel whenever he shifted in his seat. At night, he caught himself studying Meghan when she spoke, the way her eyes moved, the inflections in her voice. He searched for cracks, for moments when the weight of what she hadn't told him might reveal itself in a glance or a pause. But she was as composed as ever, moving through her day with the same confidence that had once been magnetic to him. There was also the lingering question of intent. Was this deliberate concealment, or something she had simply compartmentalized? Did she believe that by not telling him, she was protecting their present from her past? Or was she protecting herself from how he might see her differently? Every possible answer carried its own sting. The emotional fallout wasn't just about the content of the secret. It was about the erosion of certainty. The marriage had been, in his mind, a partnership without masks, a space where they could be entirely themselves. Now he had to face the possibility that there had been masks from the beginning, worn so well he hadn't noticed. By the end of the week, Harry realized he was no longer simply processing what he had found. He was living alongside it, adapting his movements, his tone, his silences to accommodate its presence. And as much as he tried to imagine a conversation where he confronted her, he knew it wouldn't be simple. Once the words were spoken, the life they had known would be gone. The only question left was whether that life had ever truly existed the way he thought it had.